an original MCM production.
Now Brad Kalsher, partner at Michael Best & Friedrich, will introduce our program. Brad?
Thank you, President Dan. And just make sure you plug your meters at the Rotary event if you don't want to see Judge Mosley. Derek Mosley graduated from Northern Iowa with a BA in English in 1992 and is a member of the esteemed Marquette Law School class of 1995. After graduation, he served as an assistant district attorney for Milwaukee County from 1995 to 2002. As an assistant district attorney, he represented the state of Wisconsin in over 1,000 criminal prosecutions. Mr. Mosley, at the time, founded the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Community Prosecution Unit, which places assistant district attorneys in various neighborhoods throughout the city of Milwaukee to work with residents to reduce urban blight and to improve the quality of life. As head of this unit, Mr. Mosley started a police and citizen crime fighting initiative called Operation Street Sweeper, which targeted street drug dealing. And this program was awarded the Law Enforcement Honor Award by the United States Department of Justice. In 2002, Mr. Mosley was appointed municipal court judge in Milwaukee. At the time of his appointment, he was the youngest African American to be appointed judge in the state of Wisconsin. In August of 2004, Judge Mosley was appointed the presiding judge of the Milwaukee Municipal Court. And as we discussed at the table before lunch, he is the only thing standing between us and anarchy. Derek sits on numerous boards and has received many accolades, including being voted Jurist of the Year for 2015 by the Justinian Society of Lawyers. Derek and his wife Kelly live in the northwest side of Milwaukee with their two daughters, Kaylin and Kieran. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Derek Mosley.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Hey. So first I just want to say thank you to Brad for that introduction. And also, those of you who don't know, Brad is my treasurer for my campaign. He volunteered once, and I haven't let him get out of it since. So thank you, Brad. Thank you guys for having me here today. I really appreciate it. My topic it's called Black History, but in all actuality, it is United States history. And the reason why I got really involved in this topic is when I was in school and we were studying history, I never saw anybody that really looked like me in the history books. So we're going through all this history, all this time, all these years, and I'm studying history. I didn't see anybody that was me, but the thing that really put me over the edge was that we did a project when I was in school, and the project was basically take someone we learned from history and do a presentation about this person. So it was at that moment I realized that I needed to learn more about Black history because of the 8 Black students in my class, all 8 of us did Martin Luther King. So I knew at that moment there had to be somebody else out there other than Martin Luther King that we could do history about. So I'm going to start by introducing you to a man by the name of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Woodson is essentially the godfather of Black History Month. He was the one who started what we call Black History Week. Dr. Carter was a firm believer of you can't really know where you're going to go or aspire to do great things if you don't really know where you came from. And that was his theory, and he actually had a quote that I kind of live by. The quote's basically, those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from teaching of biography and history. So on that note, I'm going to give you guys sort of like a crash course, 101 of U.S. history, even though it is titled Black History. So I'll start from the beginning, real quick. So I don't know if you guys were aware, but the first non-native settlers in this place that we call America were 100 enslaved Africans who were brought here by the Spanish. They were brought here in 1526, which places that about 94 years prior to the Pilgrims. It was also the first location of the first slave revolt in America, because those 100 Africans revolted against the Spanish that brought them here, which caused the Spanish to sort of scuttle that colony and then to leave, leaving those 100 Africans to fend for themselves here in America. Those 100 Africans befriended, intermarried, and became part of the Creek Indian Nation, Native Americans, lived with them, intermarried, and became part of that culture. So I thought it was pretty interesting that even to this day, because my kids are in school, and we still talk in terms of the Pilgrims being the first non-Native people here in America. But I thought it was important to know that there were some people prior, non-Natives, who were actually African. Everybody probably knows that individual right there and probably have seen that picture before. That picture is, of course, of George Washington. George Washington being the first president of the United States. What you might not be able to see in that picture is just to the side of George Washington is an individual by the name of William Lee. Can you guys see him? You can barely see him. And so you might have seen this picture before, but in that picture, William Lee's normally cut out of it, but he's always in this picture. I got a better view of him for you. William Lee was a slave who was actually owned by George Washington. And just for history's sakes, George Washington himself only owned 12 slaves. It wasn't until he married Martha and Martha's father died that he inherited about 120 to 180 slaves by virtue of his death. But William was one of George Washington's slaves who actually was with him at all times during the Revolutionary War. So he served at the side of George Washington during all 8 years of the Revolutionary War, and also was there at Yorktown as well as Valley Forge. And it's said by historians that William Lee, if he had been white, would probably be one of the most important people in the Revolutionary War and be a figure in history books because of his proximity to George Washington. But because he was a slave, he was pretty much ignored and was written out of any history books. But I thought it was important that we knew about William Lee. Anybody know that at all? Okay. This individual, his name is York. York was one of the individuals on the expedition of Lewis and Clark. He was actually a slave owned by Mr. Clark. And York was fluent in several native languages. He was a field scout and an excellent hunter, and accompanied Lewis and Clark on the expedition all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Once they reached the Pacific Ocean and came back, every member of that expedition was rewarded with money and land as a result of their service. York, however, being a slave, was not entitled to those things. York only asked for one thing, and that one thing that he asked was that during the time of the expedition, his wife and family were sold to another master. And he just wanted to find out where they were, which he found out was in Louisville, Kentucky. And he wanted to go to Louisville to be with his family. He got into an argument with Clark over that. And according to history, Clark was so upset that he actually wound up selling York to another slave owner. And that was around 1816. Anything after 1816, we don't have any record of what happened to York or whether or not he made it up with his family. That statue that you see right there is actually in Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville has sort of adopted York as their native son. And so I thought it was important. Anybody know about York prior to today? Okay, good. 2 people. This is one of my favorite stories of all time. As a kid growing up, people have their parents read them stories of, I don't know, Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. My parents read me the story of Henry Brown. Henry Brown was a slave in Virginia whose family, his wife and kids, were sold to another plantation. He was so distraught about hearing that he wanted to escape from slavery. So he was able, with the help of an abolitionist from Philadelphia, to essentially mail himself in a box to Philadelphia. He was in a box that was approximately 3 feet high, 2 feet wide. He sat in that box as he traveled by carriage, horseback, boat, horseback again, boat, and then carriage. It took him 27 hours to get there. When he got to Philadelphia, obviously he became sort of like a folk legend as the first person who was actually mailed through the mail, which also made him a lot of money because he traveled all throughout the country speaking about his tales. He adopted the name of Henry Box Brown, and he made enough money to actually buy his family's freedom. So this is a story, it's a book that you could buy now that my family used to read to me about Henry Box Brown. And aside from the black people in the room, has anybody else heard the story of Box Brown? This woman here is Kathy Williams. Kathy Williams has the distinction of being the first woman to ever enlist into the United States military. Interesting part about Kathy is that she enlisted in 1866, which makes that interesting because women were forbidden to join the military in 1866. So Kathy enlisted as William Kathy. So she enlisted in the military as a man. She actually passed her physical in 1866 as a man. And on that date, got the distinction of being the first woman to ever enlist in the United States military. She served in the military for 4 years, served in the infantry. And it wasn't until she contracted smallpox that the military surgeon discovered that she was in fact a female. And once he did that, they gave her a disability discharge, because apparently being a woman in 1866 was a disability. So they gave her a disability discharge, and she was discharged from the military. Several years later, she applied for a pension, as every military serviceman and woman does, and she was denied that pension by virtue of the fact that she entered the military illegally. She passed away several years after the denial of the disability, and because she was buried in a wooden plot with a wooden marker, there's no location of where she's buried today. Anybody know about Kathy Williams? You might not be able to see it, but this book here is called the Negro Traveler's Green Book. The Negro Traveler's Green Book was a book that was invented by an individual by the name of Victor Green. Victor Green was a businessman from Harlem who just developed this book, and this book was basically a book that was sold to African-American families. During the time where the motor vehicle became very popular, whites as well as blacks used the vehicle to travel to see more of the country. But it wasn't necessarily safe for African Americans to travel all around the country. So Victor Green invented the Green Book. The Green Book was a book that had all the hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, you name it, that catered to black people. If you were a black family and you were traveling, you never left the house without the Green Book. The reason for the Green Book was to make sure, in the time of Jim Crow and in the South, that you weren't out with your family in a hotel or in a restaurant and been asked to leave or ridiculed or place your children in any danger. This book was published all the way until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Had anybody heard of the Green Book? These lovely individuals are Richard and Mildred Loving. Richard and Mildred Loving are from Virginia. We're from Virginia. And in 1960, they decided to get married. And upon getting married, they were arrested. In Virginia in 1960, much of the South, in 1960, it was illegal for races to mixed race laws. So they were convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison for marrying each other. They fought this case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional to forbid two people to marry based on race. After that ruling by the United States Supreme Court, several states had on the books these types of laws that prevented mixed race mixing. And in fact, several southern states had it in their constitution that it was illegal to have the races mix. And so in 2000, the last state, Alabama, had removed from their constitution any laws forbidding mixing of the races. However, because it was a constitution, it had to be a ballot initiative. And so on the ballot initiative, it was voted 60% of Alabama residents thought that it should be removed from the Constitution, and 40% thought it should stay in the Constitution. This is in the year 2000. Just another piece of advice, on June 12th every year is what's known as Loving Day, is the day of the decision of Loving versus Virginia, and is the day where all mixed couples appreciate this couple here for validating their marriage. Anybody know about Loving Day? Yes. Good. All right, so this gentleman here is Elijah Mccoy, one of my favorites. Elijah Mccoy was an inventor, and he invented what's called, it was basically a lubricating locomotive. So locomotives would often have to be stopped and lubricated so they continue on these journeys. It was costly, it was time consuming, until Elijah Mccoy came around. And Elijah invented what was called the self-lubricating locomotive. He made a lot of money from it. He patented it. But even though he patented it, there's a lot of people who are making what we call knockoffs or fake versions of these. Those fake versions, however, resulted in injury to people, as well as injury to the locomotives themselves. So Elijah brought something to our culture that's pretty interesting. So when you were in the 1860s, if you were looking to get a self-lubricating locomotive, you got something that dates back to Elijah Mccoy. So if you were looking for this self-lubricating locomotive, you always demanded that you got the real McCoy. Yep. That saying comes from Elijah Mccoy. I think everybody knows this individual. This is Rosa Parks. Everybody knows Rosa and what she did about not refusing to give up her seat. But what you may not know is this young lady. This young lady is Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin did the exact same thing that Rosa Parks did. Did it on the exact same bus in the exact same city about 9 months prior to Rosa Parks. Problem is, Claudette Colvin was only 16 years old. Because she was 16 years old, the NAACP didn't think that she would be the person they wanted to put out to fight this law. So they waited. Not to mention the fact, shortly after her being arrested for not giving up her seat, Claudette got pregnant. And so once she got pregnant, she officially wrote herself out of the history books. But I thought it was important to acknowledge that a 16-year-old did what Rosa Parks did 9 months before Rosa Parks did it. I think many people have seen this image before. This young lady is Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was a young girl in New Orleans who had passed a test which enabled her to attend the all-white school in New Orleans. Ruby was, of all the students that had passed that test, Ruby was the only student that actually went to the all-white school. And on her first day of school, several of the parents of students at that school pulled their kids out of the school. Also, none of the teachers at Ruby's school agreed to teach her, except one woman, a woman from Boston, Massachusetts, who had just recently moved to New Orleans. So she taught Ruby for 1 full year as her only student. Ruby Bridges tells the story of how she would walk to school and she would be ridiculed on her way to school. She was threatened. There was one woman who took a doll and she had painted it black and hung a noose from it and would hang outside the door of the window of the classroom where Ruby was learning and would wave the doll around. And it got so bad that President Eisenhower had to call in the marshals. And I think many of you have either seen this photo or have seen the photo of Norman Rockwell of Ruby walking to school with the marshals. One of the great things about Ruby Bridges is she's still alive. She was just recently in Milwaukee, probably about 4 years ago. She was speaking at MATC. She travels around the country speaking about civil rights and racial equality. This is one of my all-time favorites. This young lady's name is Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta was a tobacco farmer who contracted cervical cancer at age 31. She was being treated at Johns Hopkins, where the doctor that was treating her removed several of her cells from her cervix, unbeknownst to her, because he noticed that those cells didn't die. They remained alive to be tested. See, prior to these immortal cells, as they're called, they're now called HeLa cells for Henrietta Lacks. These HeLa cells, doctors would have to continually try to keep cells alive before they can do tests on them to solve diseases, to cure diseases, and what have you. But Henrietta's cells were these immortal cells, or these HeLa cells, would last forever. So because of her cells, we were able to discover cures for cancer. Jonas Salk was able to come up with the cure for polio. She was also, her cells were used for in vitro fertilization as well as cloning. The pharmaceutical companies have made arguably billions of dollars off of HeLa cells, even though Henrietta's family themselves have not received any compensation whatsoever from what has happened. In fact, it wasn't until recently that they even discovered that the HeLa cells actually had come from Henrietta. There was a fantastic book about her story called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, written by Rebecca Skloot. If you have some time, it's a great book to read. Miss Skloot was actually in town recently. She spoke at a YWCA event a couple years back. But I thought it was important that the world knows probably the most important woman in the history of medicine, and no one even knows her name. So, Henrietta Lacks. I think many people have seen this image before. It is the image of FDR, and it was done by Selma Burks. Selma Burks did that, and the image that we see here, as you all know, she did that exact bust right there, but it became so popular that they decided to put it on the dime. And so Selma Burks' image of FDR is now on the dime. However, because the dime is a coin and it has to be engraved into the metal, John Sinek at the time was the chief engraver of the United States. So his initials appear on the bottom of the bust because he was the engraver, but that bust was in fact created by Miss Selma Burks. Another good one. This is another woman who I wish I would have known about growing up as a kid. This is Mary Fields. Mary Fields was born a slave in Tennessee. And then she, at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation and the slaves were free, she moved out to Cascade, Montana. And when she moved out to Montana, she applied for a job as a mail carrier. And there were no female mail carriers at the time. And so the test to become a mail carrier was they had 6 horses. And you had to hook these 6 horses up to a wagon. And whoever could hook those 6 horses up the fastest would get the job as the mail carrier. Well, even though she was 60 years old, Mary Fields hooked them up faster than anybody else, hence getting the job as the first female mail carrier in the United States. She was an interesting woman, was always found to have a pistol under her apron, as well as a jug of whiskey. She was so popular in Cascade, Montana, that on her birthday, the schools actually closed. And they had a big celebration for her every year on her birthday. Just to give you an idea about the power that she wielded, in Montana, they passed a law that said that no women were allowed to enter a bar at any time, any tavern, except Mary Fields. She was actually the only person exempted from that law. She is actually still buried in Cascade, Montana, and her gravestone is still there right outside of the town if you ever happen to be that way. Oh, her nickname was Stagecoach. Forgot to say that. They called her Stagecoach because she delivered the mail always on time, just like the stagecoach. So even when the snow was too high and the horses couldn't run through the snow, she would put the mail on her shoulders, put on snowshoes, and she would deliver the mail, hence getting the nickname Stagecoach Mary. I'll go ski. I'm trying to go through as fast as I can because I know our time is limited. This individual here is Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves was born a slave. He escaped from the plantation that he was a slave and hid out with several Native American tribes. Could speak several Native American languages. When slavery had ended, he applied for a job as a United States Marshal. And because he could speak several native languages, he was hired. And on the day that he was hired, he became the first African-American United States Marshal, which in and of itself is pretty amazing. But his story is really amazing. During his career as a United States Marshal, he has a record of apprehending the most wanted people. He apprehended in his career 3,000 wanted individuals. In fact, the story went that if you knew that Bass Reeves had your warrant, most people just turned themselves in. Back then, the marshals operated under the philosophy taken dead or alive, and Bass mostly brought you in dead. So like I said, when they found out you had his warrant, everybody turned themselves in. He still has the United States Marshal's record for the number of people apprehended at one time, number of wanted people. He arrested 19 individuals all by himself. Still holds the record of the United States Marshal Service. One of the greatest things about Bass Reeves is that Bass Reeves was the inspiration for the character of the Lone Ranger. I added this individual. This is Paul Revere Williams. I only added him because I just thought it was a pretty cool story. Paul Revere Williams was an architect, one of the first African-American architects, which is also amazing in and of itself. He did a number of places. He did the LA County Courthouse. He did the Beverly Hills Hotel. He did LAX Airport. And he did Frank Sinatra's house. He also did Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz's house as well. The cool thing about Paul Revere Williams isn't so much all the great stuff, the buildings he did, which were great, but he was an architect at the time where his clients did not feel comfortable sitting on the same side of the table as him. So he developed the technique of being able to draw his architectural drawings upside down so that he could do his work while his clients were on the opposite side of the table of him. So I thought it was pretty cool. Just a quick one. This is Dr. George Grant. He was a professor at Harvard and also the inventor of the golf tee. Prior to Dr. Grant, golfers would carry around a little bag of sand, and they would drop the sand down, place the ball on top, and hit all the way down the course. Dr. Grant invented the golf tee, a piece of wood. He whittled it into a tee and used it, and he would sell it. I mean, he just gave it away, I should say. He never sold it. He patented the golf tee, so he was the inventor of the golf tee. Anybody know that? Just some good information. One of my funniest stories, this individual here is Matthew Henson. I think many people may know who he is. Matthew Henson accompanied Admiral Perry as the first individuals to get to the geographic North Pole. What's so great about this story, though, is on their way to the North Pole, Admiral Perry got sick, and so they stopped. And so Admiral Perry was sick, and they didn't know how far they were from the geographic North Pole. So they said, you know what, Matthew, why don't you go check how close are we? And if it's close enough, we're just going to go and we'll make the trip. So, of course, Matthew Perry goes, makes it to the North Pole, plants the flag, comes back and says, oh, it's not that far. And so he became the first man to make the geographic North Pole. Sad story about him, though. When they got back to America, Admiral Perry actually gained some fame and wealth as a result of that. Matthew Perry, not so much. He was actually forgotten in the course and spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity. This is probably one of the saddest tales, and I'll just briefly hit on it. And I was unaware of this until doing my research, but it was common in the United States, especially during the time of world fairs, to have what we called human zoos. And what would happen, and this is a photo of one, pygmies from Africa were taken and placed into these human zoos during world fairs, and they were showcased all across the world, not just in the United States, and people would come from all around. There's some pretty sad stories. Probably the most famous one is an individual by the name of Ota Beng, who was a pygmy who he didn't make a lot of money, but traveling along with this circus made a ton of money. They shaved his teeth into points and tried to make him look scarier than he really was. And they went around and would showcase him. He was eventually bought by the New York Zoo. And Ota shared a cage with an orangutan for the rest of his life. Ota was so distraught as a result of this life that he once stole a gun from one of the guards at the zoo and wound up killing himself. And it wasn't until that made news that the whole human zoos were stopped. Was anybody aware that we had human zoos? Okay. This was 1920? Yep. I'm gonna give you some Wisconsin history. This individual is Joshua Glover. Has anybody ever been to Cathedral Square? All right. Probably one of the greatest events in Wisconsin Black history took place at Cathedral Square. Joshua Glover was a slave from Missouri. He escaped to Racine, Wisconsin. At the time that he escaped to Wisconsin, there was a law that was called the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act basically says that if there was a slave that escaped and that slave actually made it to a free state and the slave owner knew they made it to the free state, that the owner was allowed to call the U.S. Marshals to bring that slave back to the state. Well, that's what happened to Joshua. He was in Racine, and his slave owner came up from Missouri. He had him arrested. So the police arrested Joshua Glover in Racine and brought him to Milwaukee. In Milwaukee at the time, Cathedral Square was the location of the courthouse and the jail as well. In fact, I have a picture of my courtroom of the actual courthouse at Cathedral Square. And so Joshua Glover was placed in that cell until the U.S. Marshals were able to come and get him to bring him back to Missouri. Great story is the people in Milwaukee weren't having it. So Sherman Booth, an abolitionist here who we've named a school after and some streets, he and several other people from Milwaukee actually broke into the jail and got Joshua Glover out of the jail. And they whisked him off to Canada, where he lived the rest of his life. The greatest part about this story, though, was that Booth and all the ones who helped the break were arrested as a result of violating the Fugitive Slave Act. And they appealed this all the way up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that they would not honor the Fugitive Slave Act. And by virtue of doing that ruling, Wisconsin became the final stop on the Underground Railroad. Illinois, which was also in the north, still honored the Fugitive Slave Act. So if slaves could make it to Wisconsin, they would essentially be free. Oh, there's also, at Cathedral Square, on the the northeast corner, there's a plaque to Joshua Glover if you're ever there, take a look at it. I threw this in there just because I thought it was kind of cool. So Chilton, Wisconsin, which has a black population of 0.03%, I think, was actually founded by an African American. It was founded by a man by the name of Moses Stanton. He owned a sawmill there. It was originally called Stantonville. He sold the mill, and it was changed the name to Chilton. But Chilton, Wisconsin was founded by an African American. Another cool story. You guys familiar with Lake Ivanhoe? Okay. Lake Ivanhoe is a city which is about 5 miles from Lake Geneva. So here's a story. So as someone who's actually from Chicago, I could say this story. So people from Chicago love Lake Geneva, right? So whether you're black or white, they loved Lake Geneva. So wealthy blacks in Chicago tried to buy property in Lake Geneva, but they were forbidden from buying any property there. So what happened was there was that town, Lake Ivanhoe, which is just 5 miles away. They were able to buy property in Lake Ivanhoe. So they bought all this property in Lake Ivanhoe and actually founded a town called Lake Ivanhoe. It's named Ivanhoe because the guy who sold the property's name was Ivan, so they named it Ivanhoe. And it became the first all African-American community in Wisconsin. In fact, if you go to Lake Ivanhoe today, all the streets today are still named after African-American leaders. But what's great is this Black Lake Geneva, as it was called, had a tremendous, it was a hall, essentially, where everybody would go on Friday and Saturday nights. And when they opened up this hall, the first person to play at that hall was Cab Calloway. So Cab Calloway played at this hall, and it was packed, and about 40,000 blacks, I think, lived there at one time. And then the Great Depression hit. And all of the investors in Lake Ivanhoe lost all of their money. And on that date was the end of the Black Lake Geneva. But all the streets that I said are still named after African-American leaders. And Lake Ivanhoe is still flourishing today. Not so much as I don't think any black people live there now, but just so you know. So we have Election Day coming up next Tuesday, a primary. This individual is Ezekiel Gillespie. So Ezekiel Gillespie is a Milwaukeean who went to vote on Election Day and was turned away at the polls. And when he was turned away at the polls, he fought that all the way up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So in 1866, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled that any 18-year-old African American was allowed to vote in Wisconsin, which is pretty amazing for those lawyers in the House, and actually for everybody, because that was 4 years before the 15th Amendment was granted to all African Americans. So we were ahead of the curve. I'll go back to that. I wanted to bring this one up real quick because I don't think a lot of people are familiar with this. Has anybody ever heard the term sunset towns or sundown towns? Okay, so sunset towns, sundown towns were towns that were integrated during the day, but had to be, all blacks had to leave at night, so at sundown. And so whether it was written into their charters or their covenants, or by virtue of law enforcement or their citizens, sundown towns were white towns at night and then integrated towns during the day. I put this in there because I found out that one of the biggest sundown towns in the nation was Appleton, Wisconsin, ironically enough. For my Marquette Law grads, this is Mabel Rainey. Mabel Rainey graduated from Marquette University Law School in 1927, making her the first African-American woman to graduate from law school in the state of Wisconsin. That in and of itself is a great accomplishment. She was a lawyer in town practicing probate, and she serviced all clients, black and white. One of the interesting stories about Mabel is that Mabel had a stroke while she was in the bathtub, and she drank her own bath water for 5 days until she was found by family members. So she was a pretty strong woman. But right outside of 11th and Wisconsin, in front of Sensenbrenner Hall, is a plaque to Mabel Rainey, the first African-American woman to graduate from law school in the state of Wisconsin. I threw this one in. I think many people know this story, but this is Sally Heming. The reason why it's in my Wisconsin section, I'll tell you why, but Sally Heming was a slave owned by Thomas Jefferson. He was also a slave that Thomas Jefferson had several kids with, that was denied for years and years and years. There was a society of Jefferson descendants that used to get together, and several black people started showing up to these events, and they were like, "What are you guys doing here?" And they said, "We're descendants of Thomas Jefferson." And they said, "No, you're not." So they did blood tests, and they found out that they are, in fact, descendants of Thomas Jefferson. They are from the Heming side of that. But the greatest story, the reason why I have her in my Wisconsin section, is that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Heming had a son. They had 6 kids, but the oldest was Eston Hemings Jefferson. And when he was born, everybody freaked out, right? Because the president has a black baby. So they freaked out. And so they moved Eston to Madison, Wisconsin. So Eston lived in Madison, Wisconsin, where he actually ran for office, won. He owned a hotel, and is currently buried in Madison, Wisconsin. Eston Hemings Jefferson, in case you didn't know. Jean Point du Sable. Great story about his Wisconsin connection. He was a fur trader in Wisconsin, a fur trader in the territory which became Wisconsin. He married a Potawatomi woman, and then they traveled a little bit south. He set up a house on the mouth of this river, and that house became the settlement, which ultimately became the town, which ultimately became the city of Chicago. So he is the founder of Chicago. Oh, all right. So this one I'm going to get through quick. So this is, all right. This gentleman here was part of the Tuskegee Experiment. For those of you who weren't familiar with the Tuskegee Experiment, it was an experiment that was conducted from 1927 until 1972. Basically, it involved 600 sharecroppers. Basically, the United States government told these sharecroppers that they were going to receive free health care. But what they in fact did was inject all 600 of them with syphilis. And it was an experiment to find out what was the natural progression of the disease of syphilis. So unbeknownst to this group of men, they were injected with syphilis and then weren't treated for it just to see how it had progressed. In the meantime, they wound up infecting their wives and having several children who are also genetically disposed to syphilis. This went on, like I said, until 1972, when word of it got leaked to the press and it stopped that experiment. The interesting thing about this is that it is probably one of the direct reasons why, like my grandfather, did not believe in doctors whatsoever, did not trust them. And it's very common in African American culture that doctors aren't trusted for this very reason. And like I said, this went on until 1972. Anybody familiar with the Tuskegee Experiment? And I'll end on this note. Many people may not have known this, but the holiday of Memorial Day was started by African slaves, actually children of African slaves, as a thank you to those soldiers who fought for their freedom. The modern day Memorial Day, this is the first one held by several children as they march through the streets. They actually took the dead from the war and reburied them into a cemetery honoring them, thus making the first Memorial Day. I'll end right there, and if there's any questions that anybody has on any of this, I was just hoping I had enough information for you. Thank you. See, here's just to answer Tom's question. The greatest part about Black history for me is that it involves U.S. history. And so Journal of Truth is a great example. Tom, did you learn the Journal of Truth when you grew up? No. And so, any story you could tell about Black people in America is essentially U.S. history. And so I think it's important that we realize that these stories that I was telling to you, so did anybody learn anything today? Can I just say that? By a show of hand? Okay. All right. But can you just imagine, so like I told you the story growing up, how I never saw Black faces in history books. Can you imagine the sense of pride that you can instill into kids when they hear stories like this and see stories like this? And it's just a shame to me that these great stories of our history, U.S. history, aren't being taught to our children. And if it wasn't for the fact that I have two children that are now growing through school, that I started to research these things, that they wouldn't know these stories. So if I could say anything to any of you all, if you have any say in curriculums at schools throughout the state, that Wisconsin itself has a very rich history of being a nation that was ahead of the curve when it came to civil rights. And that's important that we teach our kids these rights and teach these kids the history of our state. So if there's anybody in here that has that power, I would ask if you could tell your school boards that this is a curriculum that needs to be taught in our schools, and I think it would go a long way. It gave me the sense of feeling like inferior as a kid, that I couldn't think of anything that my people had done that were in these history books. And when you think about it, just think how, for race relations alone, if we would have taught these things, how great this nation would be. I mean, just think that African Americans have fought in every war that this country has ever fought in, from Bunker Hill to Afghanistan. We've been a part of curing diseases. We've been a part of inventing things for the nation, and it's just important that these stories be told. So I want to thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to tell the stories, and I'll be here for a second if you have any questions. Thank you.
An MCM production.